We come to the second part of transportation, and that is the transportation modes. I would like to give you a short overview. Of course, there could be so many things said regarding technical issues, regarding the market, regarding the costs, regarding the service quality, and obviously also about the markets. But I would like to keep it short and as comprehensive as possible. And I would like to start with road transportation and the characteristics of road transportation. As you have been seen before, road transport is the mode that was growing the most in the last years. And although politics tried to support a railway as a more environmentally friendly transport mode, due to the huge advantages that road transport has, it was growing all over Europe. We only see a little change in US for some reasons, mainly because their railway was getting more and more competitive. Also, we have a huge shortage of drivers in US. We see this shortage also coming in Europe, but still, due to the fact that we were hiring people from Central and Eastern Europe, it could be handled. The advantages of road transport are very good infrastructure and very dense network. Drive with the truck or with the cars in many, many areas, even remote areas where other transport modes cannot go. Road transport is very flexible. There's a lot of trucks available, so it's flexible regarding the time. You need not so much time to plan. It's very flexible regarding also, you can change the destination, you can choose different destinations, and it has no schedule like obviously a railway has, and even ships have schedules. It's a door-to-door or house-to-house traffic, as we say. Obviously, you can stop at most of the houses and bring the goods there. Of course, in some remote islands or something, that's not possible. The delivery normally is much faster than with other transport modes, and which should not be underestimated, there's a certain responsibility of the driver. So the goods are never alone. The driver can take care of the truck and also of the goods, although there are also frauds from trucks, even frauds from driving trucks. You can see some videos in the internet. But obviously this is much easier to protect than, for example, railway wagons, which are waiting at stations or in remote areas, which can be very, very difficult to protect. And it's quite efficient. The trucks are very efficient due to the fact that they were developed for a long time. There's a lot of innovation there, a lot of different special trucks there. Obviously, trucks have disadvantages. First of all, limited capacity, at least in Europe and in many other countries. In Europe, in many countries, it's 40-ton gross weight. That means we have something like 25 tons of net weight. And if you have even a light construction, 2 or 3 tons more. We have in some Scandinavian countries 60-ton trucks, and obviously in other countries like US, or the biggest trucks I have seen are in Australia, where we have really truck trains which have 200 tons and more. We have many legal restrictions, especially driving times. For example, very often it's not allowed to drive at the weekend. Also, the driver has a limited hours that he can drive, and as only very rarely we have 2 drivers on a truck, these limits also the possibility to use the truck, as when the driver has to make his brakes, then the truck has to stop. Of course, we depend very much on the traffic, on traffic jams. So in areas, for example, cities, areas, urban areas, very often we have challenges there. And also at certain roads to certain times, for example, in holiday times, or if we have traveling restrictions at the borders, then a lot of traffic jams. We have the highest risks of accidents. That is not so much for the cargo, but of course, very high risk for passenger transportation in cars. We have the negative external effects, the CO2 emissions, but also small particles, NOx, other emissions that are harming the health. But of course, we have also positive external effects, especially the reachability of areas, possibility to have a better mobility, the destinations that you can reach. Here you see, although of course it depends very much on the country, very much on the driver, even more on if it's long distance or short distance. For example, within the city with small trucks, you have very high labor costs, instead very low cost for the cars, for fuel, and at least in Germany and Austria, very low toll costs. But on the long distance, you see the influencing factor on the left-hand side. And here on the right-hand side, you see a more or less, but very rough calculation of long-distance trucks. Of course, maybe with a European driver, and if you have a driver from White Russia, Belarus, or from Ukraine, or even, don't know, Tajikistan or something, then maybe the calculation looks different. But we have more or less here in Austria 25 to 30% cost independent of the rate of utilization. So depreciation, although with trucks, very often especially long distance, the depreciation depends on the driven kilometers. Most of the trucks reach their end of service, not because of they are so old, but they have been driving so many kilometers. And very often then long distance trucks are used for shorter distances because they are already depreciated very much. So the independent cost is cheap. The dependent cost is repairs, maintenance, and fuel. Of course, fuel is the most important, depends very much on the fluctuation. You have seen that we have we have always seen high fluctuations in the oil price, but maybe 25%. The labor cost, something like 30%, as I said, more or less. And toll prices or toll costs in Austria, very high, maybe 15 to 20%. In other countries, maybe in Germany, a bit lower, but this is only to give you an idea. Road transport so effective. That is especially due to the fact of liberalization, as we have seen in all markets in the US, but especially also in Europe. The liberalization in Europe starts in the 90s and is nearly finished. We have some regulations still left, especially regarding the cabotage. Cabotage means if a truck from another country, for example, from Turkey, is operating in another country. So, for example, in Italy or in Austria. In this case, also because it's outside the European Union, but also within the European Union, cabotage is has only limited permission. So if a truck from Turkey makes a transport from Rome to Florence, for example, that would be a cabotage. And also, of course, if an Italian truck makes a transport from Klagenfurt, which is in the south of Austria, to Vienna, he's only allowed to do this a certain number of times in a period, 3 times. International transports are allowed within the European Union always. So Italian truck can make a transport from Austria to Germany or to Denmark or Poland or other countries. we have a high efficiency of transportation companies because the competition is so strong, and for this we have quite a good capacity utilization. Although it's very often criticized that the capacity utilization is only around, for example, in groupage services, 60%, but this is due to the fact that we have imbalanced transport flows, and we have a lot of technology segments, for example, car transports, where the capacity utilization is quite low. Transport prices are, because of the huge competition and because of the efficiency of the trucks, quite low, and waiting times at borders had been nearly eliminated due to the European Union and Schengen and Maastricht treatment. Due to lower costs and overcapacity, transport companies from Eastern Europe offer low prices in international transport. You will hardly find Austrian company that is still competitive, especially for longer distances, especially towards the east, maybe to Germany, Italy. There's still possibilities, and a lot of Austrian companies used what we call the flag of convenience. At the road transport market in Europe, we find 4 different main services. First of all, full truckload. That means a truck is driving, could be big or a smaller truck, loaded by the shipper or the transportation company and is driving to the destination. This is normally the cheapest way. There's a lot of competition in this full truckload market. Then there's less than full truckload, or in German Teilladung. That means that the transportation company or the forwarder only sells certain amount of space to the customer, and then different shipments are combined. Very often we use the length, the Lademeter in German, the length the shipment occupies in the truck, as the determining price parameter. And in this way, normally one truck will drive to different places, pick up the shipments, bring it to its destination, and then also drive to different companies that are receiving the goods. There could also, of course, be a transshipment point in between. So that's less than truckload services, a bit more expensive, but very often also still very competitive. The groupage services are, we described before, as system services. That means there's a pickup from the sender. We bring this goods, the cargo, the shipment to a depot. Then we have a line haul from one depot to another depot. There could be also a transshipment point in between, and then do the delivery to the final destination. Obviously, this is the most expensive service. Of course, road transport sometimes has additional services. Could be packaging services, could be documentation. So there could be also additional services that are offered by road transportation companies. To conclude, the road transport, the EU road transport cost will increase due to higher tolls, higher driver wakes, higher administration costs, and higher control costs, also CO2 costs. And the competition between road transport companies will stay intensive as there are so many competitors, and it's also competitors from different nations, and the prices seem to be low. But as I already mentioned before, it depends on the regulations and on the CO2 prices. The prices that are discussed now is increase that would lead to higher costs. At least in Western Europe, customers and end customers are demanding more sustainable road transport solutions. We see that already in the urban areas, but also think that we will see long-distance sustainable solutions, of course, maybe in combination with railway, so we could really avoid combustive engines. There's a lot of new technologies we did not speak about that arising: autonomous driving, robotics that will be used to load and deload the trucks. There are small robots that could use road in urban areas to deliver goods, and maybe you already heard drones. Of course, this would not be then road transport, but aerial transport, with all the difficulties. Yeah, if we talk about railway characteristics, there's a very close relationship between infrastructure and the operations. The railway has an own infrastructure, and so, for example, in US, we have some cargo railways that operate and invest into their own infrastructure. In Europe, we normally have another construction, that we have the infrastructure separated from the operations. The European Union wanted this as a kind of measure to increase competition. As you can imagine, if we have the state-owned railway companies that own the infrastructure and operate a service, it would be difficult for competitors to go into the market. For this reason, the infrastructure has to be separated. Sometimes, or many times, they have the same holding. So the ÖBB, the Austrian Railway, has a holding. This holding has passenger transportation, cargo transportation, and the infrastructure. But the three ones are separated companies. Yeah, we all very often have mixed cargo and passenger services on one track, and that leads to huge problems, especially capacity restrictions. As the railway is very successful in urban areas in the passenger transportation for the commuters, the tracks are very much crowded, and there's very difficult to find the slot for the cargo companies. And obviously, where most of the countries, the passenger transportation has the first priority. Then we have another problem on long distance tracks, especially, that the passenger trains are very often quite fast and the cargo trains are slow. It's obviously that on one track we cannot bypass, so the fast passenger train cannot bypass the cargo train, and because of this we always have to find a side track for the cargo, and this slows down cargo trains very often, and if we don't do so, it reduces the capacity on the track very much. The fixed cost and fixed resources in the railway system is very high. We have very high investments into the track. Also, of course, the rolling stock, wagons and locomotives are quite expensive. We have no or almost no economic handling of consignments smaller than one wagon. The European railway companies used to offer smaller consignments, smaller shipments, but it used to be very inefficient. And as far as I know, hardly any railway company does. We have an affinity to bulk goods, and the accessibility to railway is, compared to road, very restricted. You need to have the slots. You need to have a lot of permissions. So for the railway company, the regulatory framework is much tougher than for road due to safety reasons. And also for the drivers, it's not so easy. So normally the drivers, locomotive drivers, have only the permission to drive in one country, and so it's not so easy to cross a border. Here we have the advantages of the railway system. We have efficient transport of bulk goods, or let's say big shipments, also big container shipments, container hinterland transports are very successful done by railway. We have no interference with individual traffic. That's the biggest advantage, of course, is a security issue. The railway is very secure. Ecological advantages and low energy consumption. These are two factors. One advantage is that most of the railway in Europe are using electric energy. So if we produce green energy, that's a big ecological advantage. And the low energy consumption comes from the fact that we have iron to iron or steel to steel. The wheel is steel and the track is also steel, and we have a very little friction in between both, and this leads to a lower energy consumption, lower friction. On the truck we have the rubber on the street, and that is more friction and more consumption. And of course we have in railway big entities. We have economies of scale there. The truck, as we said, very often limited to 40 tons, is smaller. So the energy efficiency of the railway quite high. Not so high like in ship, like inland waterways or in ocean ships, but this is also due to the fact that the ships are going much lower speed than the railway, and for this reason they consume less energy. It's quite insensitive against the different weather conditions, although it depends a bit. If you look at the transit, for many periods of the year in some areas of Russia, the railway is the only way to go because the streets cannot be used because of flooding or ice. And for this reason, the railway is quite insensitive. But we have in the recent years lots of problems, especially with the energy supply from the top, that trees were falling down, or we had ice on that and they were breaking. So it's not completely insensitive, but better than the road, definitely. And also inland waterways, which suffer a lot from low water and high water. We have limited congestion. The railway is controlled access, so the slots are distributed. And we have large variety of different wagons and containers, which is quite good. But to be honest, within the road transport, the variety is higher and degree of innovation is bigger. This is due to the fact that very often the railway wagons are used for long periods, for 30, 40 years. And you can imagine if the wagon that is 40 years old, the innovation degree is quite low. But there's room for improvement. The railway companies try to work on this, especially, of course, with digitalization, with sensors at the trains and wagons. But we see also here that the development in the truck sector is much faster. High number of accession points, relatively high, I would say, of course, not so much than for road. And the possibility of automation, and this is really a tragedy that the railway companies were not using this advantage. In 2006, I supposed for the Brenner tunnel between Austria and Italy, that they should design it that it could be used automatically, which is possible because the train control system allows complete automatization, or would be very easy to design that. We have the track, we have it's in a tunnel is also easy because you don't have the problem that people come from outside or some animals or something like that. I thought that it would be a very good idea to start there with automatization, but Boston Railway, and they did not like that. Actually, it's terrible that still the wagons are the coupling between the railway wagons in Europe is not automated yet. They try to start with this, but we still have a manual process there, whereas in China and Russia, we already have automated coupling. So it's not a question of technology, but it's a question that the railway companies were not so eager to introduce innovations here. We come to the disadvantage I already said. The degree of innovation is a bit low in railway. We have problems with less than wagon load shipments. And the challenge, of course, is as the shipments are getting smaller and smaller generally. This is also one reason why the railway lost market share in the last years. Unfortunately, especially for the big railway companies, which are state-owned, they have a lack of customer focus. The customer friendliness is very often limited. Also, due to the fact that many of the employees were state workers and maybe not so motivated, the logistics competence is very often much lower than we will find at logistics service providers. So Austrian Railway would like to go into the forwarding market, but it was not successful. The French Railway did the same. The Russians now bought a forwarder, but it's not an easy task and not an easy way to go. Obviously, we have image problems. Very often the people think that they are unreliable. The image of the railway, which used to be before the Second World War, very good. So the kings and the emperors, they were using the railway. That suffered a lot. And it's also, of course, a challenge. The railway is idleness and a bit inflexible due to technology, also maybe because of the organizations. And in many cases, the means of transport are required. For example, onward carriages, pre-carriages by truck with additional handling costs. So that means we have an intermodal transport necessary because we cannot reach the shipper or the receiver don't have access to railway. Then we always have to have onward carriage or pre-carriage to bring the goods to the end customer or to the final destination. We have local bottlenecks, especially in the urban areas, and that's really a burden for the cargo. We have still interoperability problems. That means that, for example, we have different energy systems in Europe. We have many different control systems in Europe. We have different regulations. In one country, the light has to be at the end white. In the other country, has to be red. So there's a lot of challenges here. And although the European Union tries to fight these challenges, they're still not successful. What is the railway market in Europe? The railway market changed dramatically due to the opening of the European market, and the idea of the European Union is to create an open single market. And also this since the 90s, but much less successful than in road sector, because the old state railways, of course, they were trying to fight and defend their position. The progress of the liberalization is very different in the markets. We have the legal liberalization in all markets, but we have in some markets really much higher degree of liberalization. In other markets, it's legally liberalized, for example, in France, but the French railway still uses a lot of measures to avoid that competitors are entering into their market. Also, the Italian market is very difficult. Belgium too. Germany, I think it's in the cargo sector, very open. In the passenger transportation, it's very difficult because we have such, if you have a big network. The commuting trains, there's a lot of competition now in Germany also, but on the long distance, there's there are some competitors, but mainly German railway. In Austria, we have a strong competitor. It's called Westbahn on the track between Vienna and Salzburg. Finalization of liberalization is the abolishment of any cabotage restriction within the single markets. It was from 2006 on. But as I said, legally it's liberalized, but there's still a lot of challenge. Actual market situation could be described as post-monopolistic, with still the big railway companies in nearly all markets. And the competitors are trying to enter to the market. In the cargo, we have a lot of small competitors. Of course, they have also some challenges. The private, it's the last point. You see private railway companies very often focus on block trains, and because they are much easier to operate and to organize. They have not the capability to set up big networks. They want to try this using corporations, but it's difficult. Although I was before a bit critical about the liberalization, we see quite good effects in Germany and also in other countries. We have a lower market price and for sure higher quality of logistics services, and the competition increases. In international transport also, which kinds of production methods we have in the railway? The block trains I already mentioned. It's a full train, let's say. So we have one train driving from one railway station to another, maybe stopping somewhere, but mainly the idea is to go from one point to another point. No shunting necessary, no coupling activities necessary. I already said that this is a big pain for the railway, as we don't have automatic couplings in let's say Western Europe or Central and Western Europe. We have some in Russia with a broad gauge, but not here. Groups of wagons is the idea is that so we could also give a service for smaller shipments. So let's say maybe 2-3 wagons, 5 wagons will come together at a shunting station. Train will be combined. And then this combined train, as you see there, the red and the green wagons are driving through the destination. And there also we have a split. The challenge here is, as you can see, the operation is much more complex. We need very often different locomotives here, because very often if you would like to drive to a shipper here or sender, then very often the final tracks are not electrified, so we have to use diesel traction, diesel locomotives. On the maybe line hole here, we use electric. Of course, the shunting is also work intensive, costs a bit, time intensive. For this reason, actually, a lot of railway companies trying to avoid these groups of wagon, and even more the single wagon loads, where only you take one single wagon from the sender, the customer that is shipping the goods, and you bring them to a shunting yard or station where you do the shunting activity. And it's very extensive. You can imagine if you have so many single wagons, maybe you have a train with 20 wagons or something, you have to do the shunting activities for 20 wagons, and you bring them, we have still the long haul here, bring them in the destination area, and then do single wagons, or maybe also you can form then blocks if some receiving companies are receiving more than one wagon. It's a very complex distribution system. It's very expensive, and it's hardly ever competitive. The railway companies try to focus on different segments where they are very competitive. You see, of course, here, metals and coal, very heavy. The railway always have an advantage if the goods are heavy, because you can carry much heavier weight on the wagon than you can transport on a truck where you are limited. Then where we have big volumes, for example, in the automotive industry, intermodal transportation, especially the hinterland transport to the ports, is very successful. If we have a good connection there from Austria to the ports, we have to the northern ports, so Rotterdam, Antwerpen, Hamburg, and Bremen, we have maybe 90% of the market share is railway. To the south, it's a bit more difficult as some of the southern ports are not so good connected by a railway, but they're working on that. And of course, building and materials and industry and consumer goods. The conclusion from the railway, especially in urban areas, there's a strong competition between passenger railway transport and cargo transportation for the slots, the track slots, which very often the passenger has the better possibility to get the slots, because of course still very political, and the politicians, they think that it is more important that the commuters get the slots. It's a challenge for the cargo, definitely. We think that the railway competition between the railway operators will stay intensive between the different nations, and also between private and state-owned operators. So that's good news, of course, for the customers that in former times had to rely on the old incumbents, the state-owned railways, and now have possibilities to have more choice. At least in Austria, Switzerland, and France, and also in Germany, there's a strong support from the government for the railway in terms of financing the infrastructure, in terms of giving also direct subsidies, for example, for intermodal transportation, for Austria also single wagons, they get some payments here. And if the road will get more expensive, as we discussed before, I think that railway for sure has a good future. In hinterland connections, the railway is very attractive and has already now a very huge market share, and it's very important also, of course, for the seaport.